So today I want to go over a level 100 Stormclaw build for the Druid. And you're going to need two unique items for this build to actually work. You need the Great Staff of the Crone and you need the Tempest Roar helmet. You need both of these or this build really doesn't work. And the Great Staff of the Crone is the main thing that makes this build so strong. And the special of this is Claw is now a Storm skill and also casts Storm Strike at 150% normal damage. And Storm Strike is another one of our basic skills. So now anytime we use Claw, it's also going to be using Storm Strike, meaning we get two basic skill uses every time we use our basic skill. And this rolls up to +9 ranks to Claw on it, and it already gives Storm Strike increased damage. So both of our basics are also going to be doing massive damage, and the rolls on this weapon are also pretty decent for the build. And then for Tempest Roar, the primary thing we need is your base Storm skills are also now Werewolf skills, and this is primarily going to be for Storm Strike. So now Storm Strike is also a Werewolf skill. So now Claw and Storm Strike are both now Werewolf and Storm skills, meaning we have a lot of additional ways to skill the damage of both of these. And next up we have our skill tree, and I've actually changed around some of the points because in the most recent patch, some of the pieces of this build actually got buffed pretty heavily. First off, being Claw got its base damage scaling buffed. So it went from 20% to 22% base damage, and that's base damage. So this has gotten a much bigger damage increase than you would normally think, meaning it's also going to be scaling more and more as you put more points into it. So we're going to want 5 points into Claw. Upgrade 1 increases its attack speed, and then upgrade 2 also got buffed. Claw has a 15% chance to attack twice, and this used to be 10%. So this one is actually a massive buff, and this is so good because if Claw attacks twice, it's also going to be casting 2 Storm Strikes because every Claw now casts Storm Strike. So this is actually a pretty massive buff as well. Then we have Storm Strike, 5 points into this. This is also very good because we're going to be getting 25% damage reduction every time we cast Storm Strike, which is going to be constantly. Then upgrade 1, it has a chance to immobilize. Upgrade 2, it has a chance to cause vulnerable. And Storm Strike does have cleaving damage as it hits multiple targets, which can also apply vulnerable to all of them. One of the big ways we're applying vulnerable over time. Then we're going down to our defensives. 1 point into Cyclone Armor. This is to give us some non-physical damage reduction, and then the active knocks everything back, dealing some decent damage, but that knockback is also very good for keeping enemies off of us, and it's also going to slow enemies when we knock them back. This is going to be very good for getting yourself out of tight situations and allowing you to spread out enemies if they're clumped around you. Sometimes there's some issues with attacking correctly when there's too many enemies in melee range with you. Upgrade 1, it slows enemies when you activate it. Upgrade 2, you get a damage reduction every 10 seconds. Then we're going to be using Blood Howl, which is just a big heal, and it's a percentage heal, which is really good because we have a lot of health in this build. Upgrade 1, you reduce the cooldown by 1 second for every kill, so we're going to be able to spam this. Upgrade 2, we gain 15% increased attack speed, which is a really big attack speed increaser. You'll actually notice the increase in attack speed when popping this. Then we also have Debilitating Roar. It reduces the amount of damage enemies deal around you by 70%, so a massive damage reduction. Upgrade 1, you get a massive Fortify. Upgrade 2, it heals you for 4% of your maximum life for every second it's active, which since we have a lot of max health, this is also a very good heal. Then we're going down and taking Hurricane, and this also got a massive buff as well to its base damage. I think it got close to a 30% increase to its base damage, meaning Hurricane is dealing a lot more damage. So one of the changes I made is I put max points into Hurricane, and as you can see, this is dealing up to 31,000 damage over that 8 seconds at a base, which is going to be scaled up heavily from a lot of our other effects, meaning Hurricane is actually dealing quite a lot of damage now. And I put 5 points into this instead of just the 1 because I think this will help you clear out a lot of the small straggler enemies much more easily, and that was one of the weak points of this build before. Upgrade 1, it slows enemies. Upgrade 2, it makes enemies deal 20% less damage, so now it's also a pretty big defensive skill. And then finally, we're going to go down, take Grizzly Rage. This is one of the biggest parts of our build. Upgrade 1 makes us unstoppable, the only unstoppable in the build, which is very important. If you don't have Grizzly Rage up, you basically don't want to be fighting any elites. Upgrade 2, you constantly fortify every second this is active. This is primarily how we're going to be keeping fortified 100% of the time. Then for our capstone, we're taking Lupine Veracity. Every 6 werewolf skill critically strikes and deals 70% increased damage. This was also buffed in the extra damage it deals. So we got 3 pretty decent buffs for this build. Then next up we have our passives, and there's a few different points you can move around in passives if you want to. First off, Predatory Instinct, increased critical strike chance when enemies are close. Enemies are basically always close when we're damaging them. And then increased movement speed while in werewolf form. We're basically always going to be in werewolf form, so increased movement speed always going to be good. Then we're going down, and we now only have 1 point into Ancestral Fortitude. Used to have 3, but I took these out because non-physical resistances are just things like poison resistances, and those are generally pretty bad right now, so took those out. We're going to put those elsewhere. Then 3 into Vigilance. You gain 15% damage reduction 6 seconds after using a defensive skill. We have 3 defensive skills, so we can have that up quite a lot of the time. Then we went down 1 into Elemental Exposure. Storm skills have a chance to make enemies vulnerable, but this is primarily to go up and to get some of these other passives. Increases the duration of Hurricane by 5%, and then 1 point into Bad Omen, up to a 10% chance when dealing damage to vulnerable enemies to spawn a lightning bolt that does some pretty decent damage. And this is where some of our points have changed. I mainly want to go up and get at least 1 point into Bad Omen because this is a pretty big chunk of damage, and increasing this just increases the chance for this to proc, and we do have pretty good lucky hit chance, so this is still going to be procking pretty heavily with only 1 point into it. Then we go down 1 into Neurotoxin. This is primarily to get Envenom. Poison enemies take 60% increased critical strike damage, and this is also a multiplicative scaling, so this is massive damage increases. 3 points into this. We have another 3 points from our necklace, which is massive. Then 1 point into Toxic Claws. This is probably the most important point in the entirety of this build. Critical strikes with werewolf skills cause a small poison over 4 seconds. Now we don't care about the poison damage itself, but if an enemy is poisoned, we have a ton of additional ways to skill damage and damage reduction, and since all of our skills are werewolf skills, including something like Hurricane, we can very easily poison all enemies. You can pop Hurricane and just walk through enemies, and they're basically all going to get poisoned very quickly. Then we go down and have 3 points into Defiance. Nature skills deal 12% increased damage to elites. Again, this is multiplicative, a lot of increased damage to elites. Then 3 points into Defensive Posture, increases the amount of Fortify you gain from all sources by 15%. This is going to help our Fortify from Grisly Rage keep us fortified 100% of the time. Now we used to have 1 point into Nature's Resolve, which gives you a small chance when being hit to fortify you, but with how much we have Grisly Rage active, we don't really need more Fortify procking, and this is a very low chance, so we took that point and primarily put it into some of these Storm passives. And then next up we have our Spirit Boons. First with Wariness, take reduced damage from elites. This is actually very important. Elites are the primary things that can kill you, usually through CCing you or just doing some big damage burst. Then we have gain 10% increased attack speed, very important as well. The more attack speed we have, the more we can spam Claw, the more damage we're going to be dealing. Then Calamity, extend the duration of ultimate skills by 25%. Our Grisly Rage is a massive part of our damage scaling and survivability. Then at the bottom we have Masochistic. Critical strikes with shapeshifting skills heal you for 3% of your maximum life, and this is so good because we're hitting so much because we're using 2 basic skills anytime we use 1, so we're hitting a lot. But then something like Hurricane, since it's also a werewolf skill, having AoE crit damage can just spam heal us to max very quickly. Then we have Calm Before the Storm. Nature magic skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds. This is how we get to keep Grisly Rage up so much of the time. And then next up we have our Paragon Boards. Now I'm primarily going to go over our glyphs and the board selections themselves. I'll have a link in the description to a build planner so you can check that out to very easily see everything I did with the Paragon board. Now currently with this version of the build, this is more for speed farming. Once you get to high 60s and above keys, this build's going to start to have some issues, primarily based upon your defensives, because a lot of my extra points just went into increasing our damage. So the starting board, we're using Territorial, more damage to close enemies. Once you get enough dexterity, you have damage reduction against close enemies. This is a lot of damage scaling when this is maxed out. Currently have 77% increased damage to close enemies, which is just 77% increased damage because we're always close to those enemies. Then we're going up, and the first board we're taking is going to be Thunderstruck. Storm skills deal 30% increased critical strike damage against vulnerable or immobilized enemies. Enemies are always going to be vulnerable when we're fighting them, and this is also more multiplicative scaling. Then the glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, grants a bonus to all magic nodes within range, and nature skills deal 10% increased damage to vulnerable or crowd controlled enemies, and that's another multiplicative scaling. So again, pretty big damage increases, and you're going to want to be getting the magic nodes within range, a lot of increased storm skill damage, and some pretty big damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. Then after that, we're going up to the left, getting all of the rare nodes on the way, then getting Thunderstruck, and you continue to go up to get Tempest, more critical strike damage, more vulnerable damage. Then we're going to be going over to the right. We're going to be taking the Heightened Malice board, which when 3 or more enemies are poisoned near you, you deal 45% increased damage, more multiplicative scaling, and this is going to be procced basically 100% of the time. The glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, gives a buff to all magic nodes within range. Then while in werewolf form, close enemies take more damage from you. Again, very big damage increases. Then we're going to be taking basically all the magic nodes here and all the rare nodes. This is going to give us pretty big damage increase to poison enemies, damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, which is a pretty big way in how we scale our damage reduction. Then we're both going to go up and go to the right, and the board we're going over and taking to the right is Lust for Carnage, but this board is primarily to take the werewolf glyph. You deal increased damage while in werewolf form. Then when you get enough willpower, you take damage reduction while in a werewolf form. This is massive damage scaling. I have almost 80% damage increase while in werewolf form, which we're always going to be in. You're going to want to be taking both the rare nodes within range because those both give a lot of willpower. Very high damage scaling with this glyph. Then we're going to go back and go up. We're going to be taking the Inner Beast node. We're not taking the legendary node itself, but the glyph on this board is going to be Undaunted. You deal increased damage while fortified. We're fortified 100% of the time. Then when you have enough intelligence, you gain damage reduction the more fortify you have. And again, this is another glyph that gives you pretty heavy damage scaling. We have over 106% damage while fortified. We're fortified basically 100% of the time. Take both rare nodes within this. Increased armor is very good, and more shape-shifting skill damage. Don't have enough dexterity for the secondary of this one right now, but might be able to move some stuff around to get that if we can optimize a little bit. Then we're going to go over to the left. We're going to get the Constricting Tendrils node. We're not taking the legendary node itself, but we're going down and taking the Exploit glyph. Increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but this is primarily for the secondary effect. When an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds, and every enemy has a 20-second cooldown on this effect. So this is very good for burst damage because the first time we damage any enemy, they become vulnerable. Very good for clearing out things much more quickly, but that's all the most important parts for these Paragon boards. Again, I'll have a build planner in the description if you want to follow along with the board point by point. Much easier to do it that way. So that brings us to our gear. And first off, for the uniques, we already went over Great Staff of the Crone, and we already went over our Tempest Roar. I'm also using Mad Wolf's Glee, which werewolf form is now your true form, and you gain +2 ranks to all werewolf skills, basically giving you +2 ranks to every single skill. And the chest piece does have pretty good rolls for, again, speed farming. If you are trying to do very high nightmare runs with like 70+ keys, you're going to want a legendary chest piece with a defensive legendary aspect such as the armor scaling, and you're going to want a chest piece all with massive damage reduction from close enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, damage reduction, and then maybe like a maximum life roll, because a legendary chest with all those rolls gives a lot more damage reduction. But this is overall better for speed running and doing lower nightmare sigils, but doing them much quicker. You have movement speed on this, you have more physical damage, and then the +2 ranks to basically all of our skills, which is going to give us some increased damage as well. Then for our legendary aspects on our necklace, we have increased attack speed. You want this on your necklace because it scales it higher than other pieces. This is going to be a lot of our attack speed scaling for our basic skills. Then one of the most important aspects for this build is the duration of Grisly Rage is increased by up to 5 seconds, but the second part of this is our highest damage scaling. Critical strikes while in Grisly Rage increase your critical strike damage by 10%, and this is increased with every crit. So every time you crit within Grisly Rage, you're getting this stack in critical strike damage. And as you'll see in some of the gameplay, especially when killing a boss, you start out hitting like 70k crits when using your claw, and it scales up to just doing hundreds of thousands with every single hit, sometimes even getting up to like 500,000 a hit. So this is our highest damage scaling, and why a lot of our build is built around Grisly Rage and staying in it as long as possible. Then on our other ring, you have up to a 20% chance as a lucky hit to overload the target with lightning damage, causing any direct damage you deal to pulse lightning damage around them. And this deals some pretty heavy AoE damage. Doesn't look like it deals a lot, but but that's a base damage roll. This does some pretty good AoE damage. And then on our gloves, Grizzly Rage now shapeshifts you into a dire werewolf. You gain increased movement speed instead of damage reduction. You also gain spirit cost reduction, which we're not currently using, but you also heal for 10% of your maximum life on every kill. This is primarily to make Grizzly Rage turn us into a werewolf instead of a bear, which would screw up the entirety of the build. So this is basically required for this build to actually work. And then on our legs, I change up this legendary aspect. So now our basic skills grant us 20% damage reduction for up to 6 seconds. Our basic skill is our main spamming ability, so we'll be able to have this up basically 100% of the time for some pretty big damage reduction. Then on our boots, Debilitating Roar is now a werewolf skill. In addition, Debilitating Roar will immobilize all poison enemies for up to 4 seconds. This is primarily so Debilitating Roar is a werewolf skill, but this immobilize when hitting poison enemies is actually really good if you have a lot of elites and a lot of enemies around you. What you can do is use your Cyclone armor to spread them all out, knock them away from you, then you Debilitating Roar, which will root them all away from you, allowing you to kill elite enemies one by one and keep all the other enemies off you for a little bit. It's pretty good when there's too many enemies and you want to spread them out a bit. Then for our gems, we're using basic skill damage in our weapon for obvious reasons. Then in our armor, we're using all ruby for increased maximum life. This build has ridiculous amounts of healing and all percentage healing, so you want really high life. I currently have almost 18,000 at a base, which will increase all of that percentage healing. This build is pretty heavily focused on a lot of healing, so our health will fluctuate a lot, but since we heal so much, it'll keep just going higher and higher as we're dealing damage. Then on our jewelry, we want all skulls for increased armor just for that damage reduction. And then next up, we have our stat rolls. And we're not going to go over any uniques. You can't change those rolls. But like I mentioned, if you're trying to do higher Nightmare Dungeon runs, you're going to want to change out your chest piece to a legendary and just basically get all damage reduction on it. Now for our amulet, you primarily want ranks to Envenom passive. As we went over, that's massive damage increase. My necklace could be better, but you also want movement speed. Damage reduction while fortified is good. Werewolf skill damage is decent. There can be some slightly better rolls for your amulet. But again, primarily you want that Envenom and the movement speed. On your rings, you primarily want maximum life, lucky hit chance, critical strike chance, and the last roll can be a bunch of different things. I have lightning damage on this, could be better, but still decent. Then damage to slowed enemies is pretty decent as well because we do have a lot of slowing effects. But again, primarily lucky hit chance, critical strike chance, maximum life. On our gloves, you primarily want critical strike chance, attack speed, and lucky hit chance. I have damage to injured enemies. I would like to change that to maybe critical strike damage or some other slightly better damage roll. On your legs, you primarily want all damage reductions. Damage reduction to close enemies, maximum life is pretty good for this as well. Just straight damage reduction. Then damage reduction while injured is also going to be a very good roll because since our build fluctuates health so much because we have so much healing, damage reduction while injured can keep you alive a lot of the time. I think you can also get damage reduction while poisoned on your legs as well. That could be a very good roll as well. Then on our boots, movement speed, you're going to want that because we always have to be in melee range, so this will help you move around a lot. Total armor while in werewolf, very good. All stats could be better. This would be better as maybe a willpower roll. And then damage reduction while injured again is going to be very good. Having that damage reduction while injured on both your legs and your boots is very good for keeping yourself alive. But that's pretty much the entirety of this build. This build is very good, pretty simple to use, and generally a more unique build than a lot of other builds you can use in Diablo 4 just because we're so focused around using basic skills, which doesn't happen for basically any other build. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.